Have you ever wondered why the most powerful empires in history suddenly crumble? Why leaders who seemed invincible one moment become paralyzed by indecision the next? The answer isn't just about armies or economics. It's about what happens inside the human brain under extreme stress. Today, we're exploring how the neural patterns that destroyed ancient Rome are playing out in modern leadership right now. If you find this intersection of history and neuroscience fascinating, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future deep dives into why systems fail and how we can learn from them. Let's start with a fundamental truth. When you experience danger or pressure, your brain doesn't think like a chess player evaluating options. It shifts into survival mode. Your amygdala, the part of your brain that processes fear and threat, suddenly takes the steering wheel. Your prefrontal cortex, the rational decision maker sitting behind your eyes, gets sidelined. This isn't a flaw. It's ancient programming that kept your ancestors alive when a tiger appeared in the grass. But here's the problem. When you're leading an empire or a company or even a team, that survival response becomes catastrophic. Roman emperors didn't sit in marble palaces calmly deliberating policy. Many of them were under relentless pressure. Political rivals circled constantly, military threats arrived from every border, resources were finite, the pressure was real and unending. And when you stay in that threat-activated state for months or years, your brain chemistry changes. Your cortisol levels stay elevated, your creative thinking withers, your capacity for nuance disappears. You start seeing threats everywhere, even where none exist. You become reactive instead of strategic. Consider what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century in Rome. For 50 years, the empire cycled through dozens of emperors. Some lasted only weeks. It wasn't because these men were inherently stupid. Many were intelligent and experienced, but they were drowning in stress. The Goths were pressing from the north. The Persians threatened from the east. The economy was inflating wildly. Plague swept through provinces, and every emperor had to navigate a senate full of rivals who would murder them if given the chance. When an emperor's brain stayed in that hypervigilant state, something predictable happened. They made decisions that created even more chaos. A general would seem slightly disloyal, so the emperor would execute him. But that general was actually competent. Remove him and the army weakens. That weakness invites more invasions. More invasions mean more panic. More panic means more purges of suspected traitors. Within months, the administrative structure that held the empire together had rotted from the inside. It was the predictable output of stressed neural systems making cascading bad decisions. Now, you might think this is ancient history with no relevance to you, but your own stress response operates on the same neural hardware. When you face a serious deadline or threat at work, your amygdala activates just like a Roman emperor's did. The difference is usually one of degree, not kind, and if you stay in that state chronically, your decision-making degrades in exactly the same ways. You become more authoritarian, you trust fewer people, you see enemies instead of allies, you make short-term decisions that create long-term problems. This is why companies run by chronically stressed leaders often fail. The leader's neural state broadcasts down through the entire organization. Employees sense the threat activation and go into their own survival mode. Information stops flowing freely because people are afraid of delivering bad news. Innovation dies because experimentation requires psychological safety. Loyalty paradoxically decreases because people know they're expendable. The organization becomes brittle. It looks strong until it suddenly shatters. The Roman Empire had another problem that made this worse. There was no stress relief valve. A modern CEO can take a vacation, they can go to therapy, they can exercise, meditate, or talk to trusted friends. Ancient emperors had none of these culturally acceptable options. To show vulnerability was to show weakness. Weakness meant assassination, so emperors would drink or rage or engage in increasingly erratic behavior, all while their brains flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. Historians often point to specific bad decisions as the cause of Rome's fall, but they're often describing the symptoms, not the disease. The disease was a leadership structure that kept men in chronic threat activation while removing their ability to process that stress in healthy ways. The brain under that kind of pressure doesn't make the kinds of decisions that build empires. It makes decisions that protect the self in the short term, even when those decisions destroy the system. Let's think about what happens neurologically. When your prefrontal cortex loses its grip on your amygdala, you're essentially operating from a brain that's about 200,000 years old. That ancient brain is brilliant at survival and immediate danger. It's terrible at managing complex systems. An ancient brain doesn't think about long-term consequences. It doesn't weigh trade-offs carefully. It doesn't consider how other people might respond to your actions. It just asks one question: is this threat? And if the answer is yes, or maybe, or possibly, it acts. Roman emperors were constrained by the actual threat level in their environment. Multiple pretenders constantly claimed legitimacy. Generals command loyalty from soldiers, not the emperor. The military was always a potential rival. So the paranoia wasn't irrational, it was proportional to reality. The problem was that the brain's threat response, which evolved for immediate physical danger, doesn't scale well to complex political danger. The ancient Romans couldn't lower their threat response because the actual threat level never dropped. They were trapped. This is actually worth pausing on because this is where the comparison becomes painfully relevant to the modern world. Many leaders today are facing genuine, ongoing threats. Economic competition is real. Political polarization is real. Technological change is relentless. Unlike Roman emperors, they have access to better stress management techniques. But many choose not to use them. They see stress as a sign of dedication. They wear their exhaustion like a badge. They confuse hypervigilance with competence. And just like those Roman emperors, their brains gradually become less capable of the kind of thinking their organizations actually need. One of the most dramatic examples involves Marcus Aurelius. He was probably Rome's most philosophically inclined emperor. He literally wrote a book about stoicism and inner peace. But even he, despite being intellectually aware of how stress distorts thinking, couldn't escape the neural consequences of chronic threat activation. He spent the last years of his reign dealing with plague and barbarian invasion. His stress response never had a chance to recalibrate. And historians argue that his choice of successor, his son Commodus, was impaired by his chronic stress state. Commodus would later become one of Rome's most destructive emperors. The irony is that during Rome's height, under emperors like Augustus and the early Antonines, the threat level was lower. These emperors had more stable succession, they had more international peace. Their brains weren't constantly flooded with stress chemicals, and not coincidentally, they made better decisions. They invested in infrastructure, they expanded trade, they built institutions that functioned effectively for decades. A lower threat state doesn't mean they were smarter. It means their brains had the neurological bandwidth to think strategically instead of reactively. This points to something crucial that neuroscience has confirmed. Your ability to make good decisions is directly dependent on your neurological state. You cannot think your way out of chronic stress. No amount of willpower lets you access your prefrontal cortex when your amygdala is screaming about danger. The Roman emperors couldn't decide their way to better decision-making. They were trapped in a feedback loop. Stress creates poor decisions. Poor decisions create more crisis. More crisis creates more stress. The system spirals. Like this video if you're recognizing these patterns in organizations or leaders you know about, because understanding these neural mechanisms is genuinely the first step to avoiding these traps. So how does an empire actually recover from this? Or more precisely, how would an emperor recover? The answer is almost paradoxical. They would need to deliberately lower their threat response when everything in their environment screams that threat is high. This is why the Stoic philosophers were so popular among educated Romans. They offered a framework for managing perception of threat. They taught that you can't always control events, but you can control how you interpret them. You can distinguish between real danger and imagined danger. You can choose focus on what you can control and accept what you cannot. But here's the hard truth. This works at an individual level only if you have time and mental space to practice it. An emperor in the middle of crisis doesn't have that luxury. He's not going to stop and meditate when the Goths are at the border. The system itself is the problem. A system that demands constant vigilance and makes any sign of weakness potentially fatal cannot support the kind of neurological state required for good leadership. This is why many historians argue that Rome's crisis was somewhat inevitable given its structure. What's genuinely interesting is that some empires found ways to reduce this pressure. The Byzantine Empire, which was essentially the Eastern Roman Empire, lasted another 1,000 years after Rome fell. One key difference was institutional stability. The succession wasn't always a death match. There were laws and traditions that made leadership transitions more predictable. This meant emperors spent less time in pure survival mode. More of their cognitive resources could go toward actual governance. Not all of them followed this pattern, of course, but the structural difference meant lower average threat levels, and lower threat levels meant better decisions on average. This is where the connection to the modern world becomes really stark. We structure organizations to maximize short-term threat levels. We celebrate overwork. We treat burnout as a rite of passage. We promote people because they're good at crisis management, then wonder why they keep creating crises once they're in charge. We essentially select for people who are neurologically trapped in threat response mode, then wonder why they make decisions that seem self-destructive to anyone outside the system. The neural legacy of Rome's collapse is still with us. Not literally, of course, but the pattern is. Whenever you see an organization that suddenly falls apart despite seeming strong, look for evidence of chronic stress in the leadership. Look for purges of talented people. Look for increasing paranoia. Look for short-term thinking replacing strategy. Look for people working themselves to exhaustion while claiming it's necessary. You're probably watching the neural pattern of Rome's crisis playing out in real time. What would change if we actually understood this? Leaders might prioritize their own stress management not as self-care, but as operational necessity. Organizations might deliberately create structures that reduce unnecessary threat activation. We might stop confusing hypervigilance with competence. We might recognize that the leader who takes time to restore their neurological state is actually being more responsible than the one who burns out in service of the company. These are radical ideas in most corporate cultures, but they're supported by everything we know about how brains actually work. The Romans couldn't access this knowledge. They didn't have neuroscience. They had philosophy, which was helpful but not enough. They had traditions and institutions, which helped some emperors but couldn't save the system. And they had the same brains we do running the same ancient software, responding to threat, in ways that made perfect sense for the savannah, but disaster for an empire. The difference between their situation and ours is that we actually know what's happening. We can see the neural mechanisms. We can choose to build systems and lives that don't lock us into chronic threat mode. The collapse of Rome took centuries. It wasn't a single moment. It was the cumulative result of thousands of stress response decisions made by leaders operating from amygdala-driven threat systems instead of prefrontal cortex-driven strategy.